My journey as a Superman fan started with a tattered red cape blowing in the wind. That ending rocketed me forward like a red-blue blur through a decade-long origin story and poignant tales of self-discovery and now fatherhood, and backward to the character's very beginnings. Now, on this podcast, we journey together across time and media to examine the stories that have defined the Man of Steel. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I am your host, Anthony Desiato. This is the Villain of the Story, Part 3. And joining me to discuss Lex Luthor, the Nemesis of the 2000s, is returning guest, sweet Bernie Gerstmayr. Welcome back.
Hey, Anthony. Thanks for having me back, man.
My pleasure. So, over the preceding episodes, we've looked at the pre-crisis mad scientist version of Luthor. We've looked at the post-crisis evil businessman version from the late 80s and 90s. And now we're turning our attention to that time, I would say beginning in the early to mid 2000s and continuing throughout most of the rest of the aughts, where a number of pre-crisis elements from the character crept back in. So his status as this renegade outlaw scientist, the green war suit, the purple and green jumpsuit, variations in colors of kryptonite, more of the Luthor family tree, specifically Lionel and Lena. A lot came back, and probably most notably of all, and something that I know will be a big part of our discussion because it was the foundation of the Smallville TV series, Lex's past with Clark in Smallville. So a lot of these aspects of the character that had been jettisoned post-crisis started coming back. And I had very specific feelings about this when I was reading this at the time. This was now, just to put it in context for people, around the time of Infinite Crisis. So it started before and then really ramped up after Infinite Crisis. And I felt one way, a very specific way, as this was happening. And my perspective has almost totally shifted now in a very positive way. So I'm happy to share sort of what I found after going through this reading assignment. And I can't wait to compare notes with you. Just to set the table for the audience, this is the question I've been asking everyone. I guess first and foremost, I've been describing Luthor as Superman's ultimate opponent. Is that a space that he occupies in your Superman fandom as well? Or is there anyone else you would put above Luthor in terms of a Superman antagonist?
Yeah, I think I would put him as either one of or the ultimate nemesis. And in this era that we're talking about, I think he's the most confusing. I think in pre-crisis and post-crisis is very cut and dry who Lex is. Lex is very sneaky in like the 2000s on, because you start to see glimpses both in TV and comics where you're like, oh, wait, maybe I really care for Lex. And he's like, nope, gotcha. And every time he really does pull at your heartstrings to feel almost bad for Lex. And we're going to talk a ton about it over the material that we assigned for this one, but I enjoy that a little bit. It's almost like a jump scare in a horror movie where you're like, whoa, and you still get caught every time. Like it's just a cat.
Yes. And we will get into this, but that was exactly the thought I had watching Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, the season 4 episode of Supergirl that introduced John Cryer as
exactly.
the Arrowverse Lex, because that was a perfect example where you're watching that and it's like, and certainly upon rewatch, I know what happens, but even the first time around, it's like, the other shoe is going to drop. There's going to be some kind of twist, but it does start to lull you into that false sense of security, and you start to second guess, or you wonder if it might be a different kind of twist, and then it's like, nope, it's exactly what you thought because this is Luthor. But the fact that they even get you doubting that is a testament to the character. Now, this is the other question I've been asking everyone. When you think of Lex, which version immediately springs to mind? Like which iteration of Lex? And it could be comics or an adaptation. Like which iteration of Lex is nearest and dearest to you?
I would say I have 3, if that's okay.
That's cheating, but all right.
All right. So like the one that comes to mind the most is Clancy Brown, Superman animated Lex in the black suit.
Okay.
So I like wherever I see Lex, I won't cheat and I'll go there. But there is also that Michael Rosenbaum, not 10 years, but that Smallville representation of that. And then also kind of the big bushy red hair Lex that I first really started reading again in the mid-90s.
Good man. And Scott and I talked about that version of Lex in the last episode when we did the evil businessman version. And I talked about how weird it was. And it's only now that I'm fully appreciating it. Because, in my mind, it's like, oh, I grew up with the evil businessman version. And it's like, I did. But the one I spent the most time with, at least initially, was that period of time when Lex was posing as his own son in a cloned body. Like, it was a weird way in, for sure.
And randomly Australian, right?
Yeah, Australian, which, and I think you and I even talked about this, or maybe Scott and I did when we did those Crisis Till Death episodes. But, they established that he was from Australia in the earlier issues, but, in the issues that I was primarily coming in with during Death and Reign, it's like, I don't know that they made a big deal out of it. So in going back, over the past year or so, it's like, oh yeah, he was like, there's this whole aspect of the character. Like, I never heard an Australian accent in my head when I was reading it.
No.
So we're at this point. Each episode that I've been doing so far, I'm like, oh, we're going to talk about Smallville in part 3. We're going to talk about Smallville. And here we are. And so I'll give my answer now to the question that I've been asking everyone. The Michael Rosenbaum Smallville version of Lex, that is nearest and dearest to me. I think it's the most compelling, and it's the one that I just always gravitate toward. I think out of all the characters on Smallville, I think he had the fullest arc and really went the greatest distance when you look at where he started and where he ended on the show. And I thought, we're looking at so many comic book stories and TV shows and movies and cartoons. And for the most part, I do think Lex has been treated well across all these various iterations. Like, we were talking off mic, but that's been one of my big takeaways now as we're pretty deep into this podcast event, where I'm enjoying them all. They all have a little different flavor, but for the most part, I'm really enjoying them. But out of everything, I feel like Smallville treated Lex the best and just was the most interesting, compelling depiction of the character. So he's the one, when I think of Lex, that's what I go to first.
So I might say something that is kind of controversial, and I don't know if it's going to damage you or whatever, but I think Smallville actually does the most damage to the Lex character, and here's why.
Okay.
It really does make you ask the question, does Clark keeping his secret from Lex ultimately turn him into Lex Luthor? So I think everybody's idea of Lex Luthor is like, well, no, he's Lionel Luthor's son. He's maniacal. He's egomaniac. He's a scientist. He's definitely evil. I don't think we really see until Smallville the possibility that if there is a history with Clark, like, because Lex couldn't really ever find true friendship or trust, is that Clark's fault? Did he almost create that?
Okay. So, no, I'm so glad you brought that up. That's a perfect question to ask. And I think that's a great jumping off point. So real quick, let me just lay out the material that you and I took a look at. And then I want to get to your question, because this is definitely something that I've been kicking around myself. So, of course, we will talk about Smallville. There will probably be a lot of Smallville talk sprinkled in throughout this episode, so get ready.
Okay.
We also looked at the Public Enemies storyline from Superman Batman. Now, I covered that previously on the show when we looked at the entire Loeb run on Superman Batman, but that was in the context of Loeb's run. This time we looked at it specifically as a Lex story. And I really do look at Public Enemies as this inflection point. I think Birthright technically had come like right before, but I really look at Public Enemies as this inflection point. Once Lex's presidency ends and he dons that war suit towards the end of it, it's like we've crossed a threshold here. And what's interesting, we'll talk about this, there is an opportunity in the Up and Away storyline where they could have put the genie back in the bottle, but they didn't.
Nope.
So it's not that Public Enemies is everything, but I really do view that as an inflection point there.
Okay.
We also have, like I just said, the Up and Away storyline, which a very underrated story. I liked it at the time, and I kind of forgot about it over all of these years. This was a 2008, 2009 story, I think. This was right after Infinite Crisis.
I will go as far. I wrote in my notes that I believe that is probably one of the best Superman Lex moments of all time in that story arc.
I'm with you. So this was a Kurt Busiek, Jeff Johns, Pete Woods story, 8-part storyline between Superman and Action Comics. This was during the 1 year later era, post Infinite Crisis. Probably not 2008, 2009, but a little bit earlier. I think I put it too far back. But very, very underrated story. I know it was 8 issues. I know it was kind of a lot, but I appreciate you and I can't tell you how much I enjoyed going back to that. We also have a couple of key issues from Birthright and Secret Origin, specifically the issues that dealt with Lex's past in Smallville. And we also have the Boy of Steel arc from Adventure Comics, written by Jeff Johns and drawn by Francis Manapul. And that was after Connor Kent, Superboy, had returned to life during the Legion of Three Worlds arc during the Final Crisis event, and set up shop in Smallville, living with Ma Kent, and was trying to reconcile this dual parentage, right? He found out that he has 50% DNA from Superman and 50% from Lex, and he's trying to figure out sort of what path he can chart for himself, and is there any good in Lex? Which leads to a lot of interesting moments. And then, of course, we mentioned the Supergirl episode from season 4, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, that introduced John Cryer. So that's what we looked at for this. Oh, and actually, before I circle back to the Lex question, and I'm not trying to delay answering this, but but I just the other thing that I wanted to ask, because talking about all these pre-crisis elements coming back, I mean, when I think Bronze Age and my podcast guests, I immediately go to you, like you're my Bronze Age guy. So I'm just curious, when these elements started coming back into the character, were you happy about this? Were you not? Were you mixed? Like, how did you feel at the time about this as someone who had affection for the Bronze Age?
Well, it's funny, like, not to upset anybody in the audience, but Lex Luthor is one of my least favorite aspects of the Bronze Age Superman comics. I think I've never liked his depiction then. I like it more. I don't know whether it's because I think as I guess late teen or adult was reading more Lex Luthor of the 90s. When I go back, I'm just annoyed by that Lex a lot. I think it's very caricature and not true identity of Lex. I don't I don't love it. I'm sorry to say. I like it a lot more, to be honest, in the 2000s.
Okay, fair enough. And I will say this, I did my pre-crisis Lex and comics episode, but, and Rich Roney was my guest for that. And we did read a selection of stories across Gold and Silver and Bronze, but we primarily read Silver Age. And we focused a lot on the Lexor arc, which I found particularly and surprisingly compelling. There was one thing, Rich and I don't think we said this explicitly in that episode, because when we had our post-episode phone call about it, and he was like, I meant to say this. So I'm going to actually cite Rich, and I'm going to mention this now. And I think his point is well taken. In a lot of those Silver Age stories, you did get the sense that Lex, as much as he enjoyed the adoration of this planet that had taken him in and viewed him as a hero, there did seem to be a genuine sense of affection for this planet and people. By the time we get to the Bronze Age, and specifically Action 544, the Rebirth storyline, where Lexor is destroyed, ultimately it's Lex's fault, but of course he blames Superman. But in the lead up to that, he's sort of terrorizing the planet. He creates this villain that he feels will kind of be a diversion for Superman, but it's him. Yeah. And even just in his attitude and his comments towards the planet and towards the people, it seemed to be rather divorced from the more affectionate version that we had gotten in the Silver Age. So to your point, I could see kind of being a little bit fed up with that version by the time we get to the end of the pre-crisis era. Yeah,
Silver Age, I'm more okay with. Bronze Age, again, it's that split. It's like, why you really shouldn't be divorcing yourself from humanity. If anything, you should be sticking up for it and more frustrated with the alien. And that's why I don't like it. I don't enjoy that aspect of it as much, but I like the earlier iterations of it.
I hear you. That makes sense. So we were talking about this off mic. When I was originally reading these stories from Public Enemies forward, I did not like the return of the pre-crisis Lex. And even though I hadn't really read much, I had read barely any pre-crisis Superman, other than whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow and maybe a couple of other stories.
Right.
But I knew what they were pulling from. I knew enough to know, like, okay, like the war suit was, I knew where all of that was coming from. And I sort of, my cynical take at the time, I just felt like we're regressing. I felt like, well, Jeff Johns and Jeff Loeb, they love the Silver Age. That's what they grew up with. And that's what they're injecting back into the character. And this is not, quote unquote, my Lex. That's how I felt at the time. And I felt that, and we talked about this last time, that, the idea, it's so compelling that Lex, the businessman, sort of is always able to get away with it. Superman can't prove his misdeeds as much as he knows it, and then Lex holds that over him, and all of that. And I felt like that was a compelling take, and it was, we had moved into a new era of Lex, and now we were going back.
Yeah.
And that's always how I felt until now. And my view has changed for two reasons. Number one, I've now read so many of those pre-crisis stories, and now I have some of that same affinity for the pre-crisis Lex. So to see those elements come back, but to be told through a modern storytelling lens, it's pretty cool to see Ed McGuinness draw Lex in that green warsuit, or to see Francis Manapul draw him, in the prison garb in that Boy of Steel arc. So that changed my perspective. And then the other one, I have to cite your fellow guest, Scott, who was on the last episode. And he said this in this episode. I've been thinking about it over the past week. I was like, this really made this kind of unlocked it for me. Scott's argument was that Lex as the president was sort of the culmination, the climax of the evil businessman iteration of the character. And it sort of begs the question. It's like, well, where could you go next? Now, of course, he could return to the corporate side. I mean, there are plenty of things he could do. He could start a social media platform or his own network, a la the real life person that version was largely based on. There are clearly places you can go. However, we had gone through that, since the mid to late 80s. So that kind of changed the way I looked at it. So kudos to Scott, because I was now rereading Public Enemies. I'm like, this doesn't really feel like the culmination of the post-crisis Lex, from the businessman to the president. This idea of, him creating this facade that really fools the public, not Superman, but the public, and Superman can't put him away. And he's at the top of the corporate world, and then he ascends to an even higher position, the highest position, one can have in the country. And Superman feels so betrayed by that. So the idea that sort of marks the end of that version of the character, but not totally, because it's not like we get a total revamp. His past as that businessman does remain intact. So we end up with more of an amalgam of the pre and post crisis in the stories that we're talking about. And overall, I think that works. So those two factors really kind of flipped my whole view on it, which I'm happy to say, because now I'm able to enjoy these stories when in the past I kind of didn't. Public Enemies is a very interesting read, because it's really the quickest transition, because over 6 issues he transforms like from that calm, collected president to just maniacal power suit, and it's really, really cool how he does it. Yes, and which we'll get into. But to go back to your question, so Smallville inspired the name of this event, the villain of the story, because of course in the season 4 episode Onyx, Lex is split into his good half and bad half after a mishap with black kryptonite. And he has one of the iconic moments of the series when he confronts Clark and the Kents in the barn, and he says, "You were right about me all along, Mr. Kent. I am the villain of the story." Great. It's one of those, as you're watching it at the time, it's like, oh my God, like you're waiting for that. Yeah. So that inspired the title of this event. And then the season 6 episode Nemesis inspired the specific title of this episode. Do you remember that one?
Remind me, which is that one? Because that's not one of my top 5.
Okay. So this is one of my favorite episodes of the whole show, and definitely of the latter part of the series. But Clark and Lex, their friendship now has been over for a season and a half, and they're trapped underground in the mines. And there's kryptonite.
Yes, and he leaves. Like Clark goes to leave, or no, one of them is trapped under wreckage. Isn't that what happens?
Clark is trapped, right, and it looks like Lex is leaving,
right?
But then he comes back and he saves him. Mm-hmm. And again, they haven't been friends for a long time. They haven't had as many of those scenes together, and this forced them into that situation to really confront what's gone on between them. And Clark says to Lex at one point, he says, "Were we ever really friends?" And Lex says, "I honestly wouldn't know. I don't have anything to compare it to. You're the only friend, the only real friend I've ever had, until you turned your back on me and saw me as your nemesis." Yeah. And the way I prepared the Smallville piece of this episode was I sat down with my iPad and I opened up Hulu, which is where Smallville is streaming. And, I know the show so well, that I was just going season by season episode, but like I knew the moments I wanted to hit, and then I was scrubbing through to find the scene that I wanted. What was interesting was to see these recurring pieces of dialogue. Like, and now you can argue this was lazy recycled writing or that they were creating a motif, because between season 6 and 7 in particular, there are at least, because I didn't go through everything, but there are at least 4 instances of Lex claiming that someone, usually Clark, turned their back on him. And the 4th one is in the season 7 episode Persona. He confronts his cloned brother, Julian.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Right? Because Lex has warned him to stay away from Lionel. And Julian's like, no, like I'm going to build a relationship with him. And Lex like, you turned your back on me. And then he later has Julian killed at the end of the episode. But the other instances, they're all directed towards Clark. They said, if you turned your back on me, you turned your back on me. And there are other sort of echoes of that in other stories, like in Up, Up, and Away, when Lex and Superman have their final physical battle at the end.
Yeah.
You know, Lex again is talking about how, like, I had everything. I had the city in the palm of my hand, and then they turned from me to you. He doesn't use the literal words, turned your back, but
right.
It's still that same idea of this betrayal. Like, this is a person who feels very betrayed. And going back to what Scott and I talked about last time, someone truly incapable of love. And, you know, we can get into that more because there are a lot of instances of that. But in any event, that particular episode of Smallville and the echoes of that dialogue and those sentiments really resonated with me. So at the end of that Nemesis episode, Clark has a heart-to-heart with Martha, and he brings up exactly what you just said, where he's like, I saw something down there in the mines that I haven't seen in years, my friend. And he goes, part of me wonders, like, if part of Lex, you know, who Lex turned out to be is because of me. So I think it's a valid question. It's one that I think as a viewer, you're meant to have. I think it's one that Clark has, but I don't think that hurts the character of Lex or anything like, I think it makes it interesting. Like, I don't like the idea if it's totally one-sided. It's like, yeah, Clark might bear a little bit of responsibility here. Yeah. So I think that is here's the thing. Would I go so far as to say, yeah, Lex, Clark is responsible? I don't think I would go that far, but I think it's a valid enough question at least. So, but I don't see that as any kind of negative or anything that takes away from the character, because I don't think here's the thing. If Clark is culpable, and I do think there's an argument to be, I'm going to make it in a minute. I do think there's an argument to be made, but at the same time, it's not the sole factor.
Okay. I do always wonder, and you know, you see a lot of what if or Elseworld stuff that's always done. It'd be so interesting to see a dive in where instead of Clark keeping the secret from Lex, think about the resources that Lex had. And if Clark let him in, even against his parents' wishes, if they teamed up in a way, how awesome. Lex could have used his resources to really help Clark keep his identity secret, but almost helped him become Superman sooner and do these things. And you see throughout the first 3 or 4 seasons of Smallville, Lex is just like, Clark, just let me in. Like, just let me in. I want to help. I want to know what's going on. And that door keeps getting shut. And every time that door is shut in Lex's face, that hurts. And I mean, even if it's not a Clark and Lex thing, you know, like if that happened in a personal, real friendship, that would cause some serious trauma or like damage. Thinking like, who am I? Like, why can't I receive love? Why can't I receive trust? Is there something wrong with me? And like that, I think that's what ultimately could push Lex towards the dark side.
So to your earlier point, yeah, one of my regrets with Smallville, and I did a whole 2.5 hour episode about all the things I wish it had or hadn't done.
Yeah.
But I do wish, they did a few what if episodes along the way, but they never did one where we got to see what would have happened if he had told Lex. And I do think that's a missed opportunity. I think that would have been interesting.
Yeah.
In looking at a lot of key Lex moments over the course of the show, again, this idea of being unable to love really became very clear. And it's, again, there's the friendship with Clark and then its deterioration obviously plays such a key role in his journey, but like I said, it's not everything. So
right.
it's established fairly early on that Lex and Lionel think that Lex killed baby Julian, his little brother, right? Because Lionel walked in and Lex was standing over the crib. And then there's a season 3 episode, Memoriam, where Lex undergoes this process to recover his lost memories and realizes that it was actually his late mother, Lillian, who had killed Julian because to save him from the parentage of Lionel, who over the course of the series is the master manipulator and just puts Lex through the ringer emotionally, psychologically, physically at times. And of course, that's, such a, the juxtaposition, the contrast between the parenting of Lionel versus Jonathan Kent. And that becomes a driving theme in the series. But, and Lionel, of course, has his own redemption arc as the series goes on. But certainly in those early seasons, it's really an antagonistic role towards Lex. And so, that was one of the things I thought about, the fact that, one of Lex's earliest memories, which he represses, but then, of course, later recovers, is, seeing his mother, quote unquote, show love by killing. And in the series finale of the show, I know I'm jumping around here, but bear with me, people. I give context for everything. In the series finale of the show, in Lex's final scene, he kills his sister, Tess, or Lutessa, Lena Luthor.
Right.
And he says he's doing it to protect her, to save her from becoming like him. It's so twisted, but this idea of killing your own family in this misguided attempt to protect, it's like it goes back to the very beginning for him. And of course, she has the best reply. Do you remember?
No, what did she say? Because that's when isn't that also when she gives him the toxin?
We're going to get back to that.
Okay.
I got a lot of thoughts on that.
All right, yeah.
But she says, it's too late. Clark already saved me.
Oh.
And which, that had been a big part of the final couple of seasons. But, there's that. And certainly Lex's moment of killing his own father in that season 7 episode. And
man, you're just rattling off my favorite Lex moments.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
But just this idea of within the family dynamic, at least, but then even beyond that, in season 6, he marries Lana.
Yeah.
And initially, she's a willing participant in the relationship, but by the time we get to the altar, she's forced into it by Lionel, and then Lex tricks her into thinking she's pregnant. It's very dark and twisted.
Yeah.
But at the end of season 6, Clark finally reveals his secret to Lana, and she decides to leave Lex. And do you remember the scene at the end of season 6? Because this is one of my favorite Lex moments.
Now, is this when Lana is basically forced to not be around Clark ever again? Is that what you're referring to?
No, that happened earlier. That was actually Lionel manipulating her into marrying Lex.
No, I'm talking about why. I'm talking about like why she can never be around Clark anymore.
So that's season 8.
Oh gosh. Okay, man.
But no, it's all. So she has this scene, this confrontation with Lex, where she tells him she's leaving.
Okay.
And she literally says to him, this theme that we've been talking about. She says to him, like, you don't know how to love. The reason why this moment really stands out to me, I don't like what Lex does in it, but what it shows about Lex was just very telling and really illustrated where he was in his journey. And the way this was staged and acted was really, really well done, because at a certain point in the scene, Lana's like blocking the door, and then like Lex walks past her, and it looks like he's going to walk through the doors and the scene's going to be over. And based on all the scenes we've watched on the show, people, they have their confrontation in the mansion, in the study, and then they walk out.
Yeah.
And you think that's where it's going. But Lex stops at the doors and he closes them. And he turns around, and you get like, it's just it's a tense scene to begin with, but it's just like the tone gets even darker, because it's like, oh, like he's not letting her leave. Like, where is this going? And the sort of the final precipitating moment is when he says, is this about Clark? And she's like, he means more to me than you ever will. He hits her. He physically strikes her. And, it's tough to watch, and you don't like that the character did it, but it really just shows where he is. And as difficult as the actual slap is to watch, it was the closing of the doors that it was just like, oh, like we've really crossed this threshold here. And the character is so much further along this dark journey. But again, I know, talking about this for a bit, but just this idea of the inability to love, and we talked about the family side, but even in this romantic relationship with Lana, it's it's built on deception and control and manipulation. And it's like, that's all he knows based on how he was raised.
And that's exactly what I was going to say, thinking about that is the further along the story he goes, it's this very interesting contrast of Lex never wanting to be his father, but ultimately turning into him. Like every time he makes a step towards not being Lionel, the way he's responded to, or the way events unfold, it forces him back on the road towards Lionel. And like, that's a perfect example. Like what he did there, like Lex, like that was going towards the journey of trying to be better, would leave and let it rest. Lionel would close the door and go back and take control again. Like that, it's just a master manipulation, like you're saying. So that always made me sad, where you could then go, oh, like he's another step closer. It's like watching Star Wars, you know, it's like, oh, now he's leading one more step towards the dark side. He makes this choice. That always made me sad when Lex was trying desperately. He's like, please, I just want somebody to trust, care, and love me. But then he gets betrayed. If you look at all the relationships over the course of the show, not Lana, but just, what was it, Helen, and then all the different people throughout just betray him.
Exactly. And going back to what, you know, your original question about Clark's culpability in this,
yeah,
I feel like Clark comes off the worst and in one of my favorite Lex moments, and it's in the season 7 episode Descent, after Lex has killed Lionel. Their confrontation in the mansion. And did that scene stand out to you as well?
That's my number 5.
Nice. Yeah, that's on my list. And
yeah,
you know, the thing about it, again, Lex talks about how Clark, you know, you turned your back on me.
Yeah.
You never turn your back on Lex. That's the takeaway here. If you turn your back on him, if he feels you have turned your back on him, you're done. Mm-hmm. But Clark says to him, I tried to be your friend, Lex, but all you care about is power and control. And Lex's comeback was maybe one of the purest moments for the character. He goes, this is Smallville. Meteor freaks, alien ships, cryptic symbols. These threats are real, and someone has to protect us. And this is where Clark kind of lost a few points for me. I'm paraphrasing, but he's something to the effect of like, you know, you sound delusional, Lex. And it's like, here's the thing. It's one thing about protecting your own secret, but there's all this stuff. And this is the other big part of Lex, right? There's manipulation, there's betrayal, but there's all this stuff in his life he can't explain.
Oh yeah.
And the person who he knows has the answers, just continually lies to him. And it's like, yeah, what effect does that have on you? That's gotta screw you up.
Well, to use like a modern term, like Clark just gaslights Lex the entire show.
Yeah.
And sometimes, like you said, not because he has to, he's just so used to doing it at a certain point that now he doesn't realize what damage he's actually doing to Lex, and then pushes Lex over the edge. And then you see it towards the end of the show.
Yeah, for sure. But, and you know, I don't want to make it sound like we're done with Smallville. We'll keep talking about it. I know. I want to get into the comic stories, but the other big line from Smallville, from the finale in particular, that always has stuck with me for over 10 years now, and that I think kind of sums these two guys up for me, is when Lex returns and he says to Clark, we have a destiny together, only on different sides. Like these two men, the way I see the dynamic, are so intrinsically linked. And the idea that maybe Clark could have set Lex on a better path, or maybe something could have been different. In the end, I think probably not. I think between Lex's nature, you know, throughout the show, we see, you know, there are various devices they use, like when he's in his head and he sees the good version of him, the little boy, and or when he split off into in the Onyx episode that we talked about. The show establishes there is darkness inside of him, so there is that nature, but maybe he could have overcome that with different nurture, with a different environment. And I think there were just too many things stacked against him. And sad to say, Clark, at a certain point, I think is one of them.
Yeah.
But I think that's so interesting. Like, that's the thing. Clark doesn't, you know, it's not like I want Clark sullied up so much, but it's like, you know, he can have a little bit of that on him. I think that makes it more interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. And even you see it in that Hourglass episode in the early part of season 1, where Lex first, that's one of my moments too. Lex first sees the vision of the future and he's scared, actually. He doesn't respond with, "Ooh, am I going to be in charge?" Like you can see the look of dread on his face. Like, what does that mean? Why all the blood? Why all the skulls? Like, am I really in charge? I'm not sure I like this. And it's not ego. It's fear. And that would be a turning point if somebody had helped him there, going, "Okay, no, we can do this together. It's okay."
Yeah, he's truly. I really feel like he's a tragic figure, and the show demonstrated
and the comics. And the comics. He's damaged.
Yeah,
he's ultimately damaged.
He is. But the show, I think, more than almost anything else, really showed his humanity. And especially getting to see him in those early seasons, like he's the nicest guy in town, and you know there is that element that genuinely, I guess that's the line though. It's like genuinely wanting the friendship with Clark versus wanting what Clark has, wanting the parents, wanting the the love of someone like Lana. I'm sure, I guess a little bit of both, but very interesting. So let's take a quick commercial break, and then we will continue unpacking all of this. We'll be right back. Acme Comics is a locally owned and operated full-service comic book store in Greensboro, North Carolina, for people of all ages and walks of life. Since 1983, this 9-time Eisner Award nominee uses their collective knowledge and resources to connect you with the best material available. They pride themselves on their significant contemporary and vintage back issue selection. Mail order subscriptions to new releases are available, and all offerings are available to anyone, anywhere, via mail order. Follow Acme on social media and eBay, listen to the Acme Cast on all podcast services, and visit acmecomics.com for much more. Film lovers and filmmakers should check out this family of film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and In the Cut in Bloomfield, New Jersey. I was fortunate enough to have my work shown at these festivals, and I found them to be very enjoyable and well-run events. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news and updates about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, be sure to listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and currently under new ownership, Moose sells a wide selection of new and old comics from every publisher, action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Flat Squirrel Productions is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP, that's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions, to save 10% on your order, and it helps support the show. Thank you. And we're back. So again, we'll circle back to Smallville, but let's get into some of these other stories, particularly the comic book stories that we read. So especially upon now, did you read Public Enemies, or did you watch the animated movie?
I reread Public Enemies.
Nice.
I like the animated film, but I'll always want to go back, and any chance to see Em McGinnis artwork is what I'm going to take a chance to do.
I ended up doing both because I hadn't rewatched the movie in a really long time, and it's one of my favorites. It was a lot of the DC animated movies, they've moved away from emulating the style of the artist whose work they're adapting.
Yeah,
but
unfortunately.
For this one, they really drew from Ed McGuinness, and it's great to see. And they brought back Kevin Conroy, Clancy Brown, and Tim Daly, and it was just so cool. Even though it wasn't set technically within the continuity of the Bruce Timm verse, it really had that feel, and especially with those voice actors, it was a lot of fun.
Well, I know this is going to sound like weird, but any chance I can validate why I own the amount of trade paperbacks that I own, I was like, oh, good, I get to take Birthright and Secret Origin and this off the shelf and actually use it, and it's not just sitting on the shelf anymore. So I reread Public Enemies actually today. That was the last thing I read today.
Nice. And so for anyone who's not familiar, I know it's a very well-known story, but giant kryptonite asteroid heading for Earth. and Lex declares Superman public enemy. He puts $1 billion bounty on his head, blames him for drawing this asteroid to Earth. And so Superman and Batman have to team up to escape this army of metahumans who have come after them to collect the bounty, while at the same time actually trying to stop the asteroid from colliding with Earth. The animated movie spins it a little bit differently. Lex frames Superman for the murder of Metallo and uses that to put the bounty on his head. The asteroid is still coming, but that's not what he pins on Superman, so it changed it up a little bit, but the broad strokes still remain the same. So how did this hold up for you on reread?
It holds up really well, but like, it's very interesting. I said this to you before we started recording. Over the course, I wrote this down, over the course of the issues, Lex goes from calm, collected, and caring about Superman and making sure like we take care of him first, and then it shifts to cold and calculated, emotionless. It's Superman's fault, to then full on like won't listen to anybody, maniacal, off the deep end. I'm in a power suit. I'm gonna off everybody. It's great though. Like it is. Oh gosh, what's the best way to? It's almost like not satirical. That's not the word. It's such an exaggerated big approach to the characters, I think.
It's like a blockbuster. I mean,
yes, it's like a summer movie. Yeah.
And it came out in the summer, if I remember correct. And I remember it was just started working at my local comic shop. Like I remember when it came out, and it was so exciting because, you know, I was such a fan of the Jeff Loeb, Ed McGuinness run on the Superman title. And then they had left, and shortly thereafter launched this ongoing Superman Batman series, and it was going to, you know, resolve this thread of Lex as president. Oh, you've got your poster there of the.
I just realized it's right behind me. Beautiful. Yeah, that's one of my favorite things from when that comic came out is the ads they did for it. That it was a big deal too, Anthony, because I'm trying to think, what year was this that it came out? Do you remember? What
did like 2003.
Yeah, like there wasn't really a Superman Batman book for, I want to say, decades. I don't think.
Not an on. You're right.
Not since World's Finest, before they started doing, they got rid of the title.
There were two World's Finest miniseries that they did like in the late 80s and 90s, but not an ongoing.
Not a monthly, right? Yeah. It was a big deal. Everybody was super excited. And then they get this as the first story, and it went bananas. And it went for quite a long time, too.
Yeah, for sure. You're not wrong. Lex does deteriorate very quickly. If I have one qualm about this story in both the movie and the comic, it's not only how quickly he turns, but the fact that it seems motivated largely by this Bane, Venom, and Kryptonite concoction that he's injecting with himself with, which very clearly seems to be it's enhancing his body. Yeah. But it also seems to be wreaking havoc on his mind. And I just felt like, why?
Yeah. Why do we need this? There's a line at the early part of the story arc where he even says, you don't have to tell me about the effects of kryptonite poisoning. And then it's like, dude, you're being affected right now by kryptonite. Like, that's the issue. You're just jacking yourself up with it and you're going off the deep end. That I found that amusing even as reading it. I was like, but does he understand what's happening?
Yeah, 100%. Like that doesn't really track. And also, I think the thing that bothered me was, like I said, you know, what was the purpose of this from a narrative standpoint? I mean, other than to expedite his mental descent, but you know, he ultimately dons the war suit and engages Superman physically in the suit. Like, here's the thing: if he ended up fighting Superman hand to hand because he has this Bane venom flowing through him, it's like, okay, I get why you did this. But if you're just going to put him in the suit anyway, it just felt like, I felt that did a disservice to the character. It's like, if you want to have him lose it, let him lose it. Don't give him that. Now, I guess you could argue the decision to juice himself in that way was him losing it, but it was an odd choice. I still don't like it.
Well, you do one or the other, like you said. Either get all venomed up through kryptonite and then be a superpowered being, or just do what you want to do with the gimmick and put the suit on, but don't go, just still be cold and calculating Lex Luthor, but in the suit. but the two didn't seem to work right off each other. And I didn't like even the very, very last page where he's got like the crazy eyes and veins coming out. It's just odd. It threw me off. But then it kind of dissipates in the next story arc, so it's fine.
Right. I mean, I guess, and again, I just reread and rewatched, but I'm wondering, was there enough, how do I put this? Absent the Venom and him really going off the deep end, was there enough for them to have really taken him down? Like, I guess more from a plot point, did you need that? Because it's like, the asteroids, I mean, the main thing that keeps coming up, especially in the comic, is that he's made this alliance with Darkseid.
Yeah.
Right. And the Darkseid is the one who supplied him with the suit and told him about the asteroid coming. Yeah. So that seems to be some dirty business there, but would that have been enough to topple Lex's presidency? I don't know. So part of me wonders if that was more a matter of convenience. It's like, we need something to like really show like this guy is unfit to be president, so we'll do this. But I feel like that, like I said, I do think that did a disservice to the character.
It was, as much as I love going back to read this story, you can tell, very similar to a summer movie, how there are beats that you have to hit in a summer movie that make it a summer movie. I feel like, for example, there was no reason to have future Superman come back and beat up present Superman. They didn't really even explain that thoroughly. So I just think it was almost like, we want to hit this, and this, make it a big blockbuster, come back to Superman, Batman, and then we'll start the ongoing monthly. So that's the way I see it.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And what's funny is the animated movie completely jettisons the future Superman, which makes sense, like, because it really lifts right out of it.
Yeah.
There's so much, obviously there's so much great interplay between Superman and Batman, and I know we've covered that before, but the narration and getting to see how well each of them knows the other is great.
That's so good, and it's actually so kind inside the narrations, how they like respect each other in the narrations, but they don't always say it in person, which is kind of interesting.
Yes, and little moments too, like when they're carrying each other through the sewers to the Batcave, and Superman's been shot with the kryptonite bullet, and there's just this little moment where Superman's like, "Whatever happened to Magpie?" And Batman's like, "I think she died." And Clark's like, "Why don't any of the good villains ever die?" And Batman's like, "What the hell is a good villain?"
That's what I love when Batman says, "What the hell is a good villain?" Like, yeah, I enjoy the story, but it's not great.
I mean, I do think there, like I said, like you said, there are some of those beats there that do sort of feel, like they're there for the reasons we talked about. But overall, it's a lot of fun, and again, I think really is like a big fun culmination to this President Lex storyline. Yeah. And look, I've said in the past that I kind of wished, I know Clark ultimately gets to write the story about Luthor's downfall, but I guess part of me wishes that Clark the reporter could have played more of a role in all of this. I know at the end of Loeb's run on the main Superman book, he had set up this thing where, Perry had fired Clark from the planet, but it was all a ruse, and Clark was going to be working undercover. That never went anywhere. So stuff like that feels like a missed opportunity. But the Lex pieces that really stood out to me here, and it's actually more prevalent in the movie. So in both instances, there's an attempt to break up the asteroid by firing missiles at it, right? They use a boom tube to get the missiles there, and it doesn't work. Right. The animated movie makes it a lot more explicit that Lex messed up, that he didn't properly account for the radiation from the asteroid causing the bombs to detonate too early.
Oh, okay.
And not that this is the biggest deal in the world, but it was one of those things where it's like, this comes up, especially in Up and Away and Boy of Steel that we also read, this idea that, but for Superman, Lex would cure cancer and solve all of humanity's ills, like all of this. And yet, in so many of these, Rich and I talked about this, a lot of the pre-crisis stories, even going back to Lex's Silver Age origin in Adventure Comics, right, where he causes this lab fire, and Superboy tries to save him, and he uses the super breath, and inadvertently causes Lex's baldness. But that's what Lex fixates on, not the fact that his own incompetence caused the fire in the first place. So again, just this idea of Lex using Superman as this excuse, yet when he has his moment to shine, it's like he doesn't have what it takes.
Well, and we'll get to it when we talk about Adventure Comics. We'll get to this, how there's more to that too, where he could do it, but he could also not do it.
You know what? This was one of the big questions that I wanted to ask you, and I think we don't have to go in a linear fashion here, and I think this is a good connection point, because this was something that I'm still kind of wrestling with. So in this Boy of Steel arc, long story short, we find out that, and this had been established pre-crisis, but now for the first time post-crisis, Lex's sister Lena is in the picture, and she's in a wheelchair, and her mental faculties have diminished, and Superboy challenges Lex to help her. He's like, you always say you could do it, so do it. And Lex does. He creates this serum that lets her stand up, and her mind is clear, and then he takes it all away.
Oh,
and
it's terrible.
And he injects her with something else that removes it. And what stood out to me was the cruelty, and that's been a running theme in these stories, especially with the evil businessman version. And it continues here, this really cruel streak in the character. But then I said to myself, I don't know if I like this idea that Lex actually is capable of doing that. Before I go any further, what do you like, especially in that Boy of Steel story? Do you like this notion that, he actually can do these things?
Well, there were a number of things in that story arc that I really loved, because it did kind of change the spin. But the line he says, and I think you put this maybe in a post, but miracles don't exist, but Lex Luthor does. Now, this is a thing that we haven't always seen. We see Lex be evil. We see Lex do evil things. Now Lex has a God complex. So now he loves the fact that he can literally manipulate life and death and people's quality of life. Like, why would you not just create the cure, but then create the disease also, so you can give it back to your sister? That's messed up. Like, again, he says miracles don't exist, but Lex Luthor does. A benevolent God does the miracle. An evil, terrible God puts evil onto somebody else or takes things away. That was frightening to me. And he even, this is a little quote that he said, but he said, I wouldn't mind kicking Superman's dog. Yeah. Like, that was another line that I was like, ooh, that's kind of right. Like, Crypto's just laying there also in pain. I'm like, dude, you're going to kick a guy's dog? Like, that's not okay.
This was one of the questions that I asked Scott last time, and I continue to think about it, is how much humanity should Lex have? Because there are a lot of stories, and a lot of the ones that we talked about last time, and even here now, and you cited two perfect examples from the Boy of Steel arc. And, you can make the argument he has none, because it's like, if there were anything that might pull at whatever humanity he has, you would think it would be his incapacitated sister. And that's clearly not enough. And that's why I go back to the Smallville iteration of the character, because I could never see Rosenbaum's Lex doing that.
Right.
And that's where I feel like it's a bridge too far. And that's why I did like a lot of those Silver Age stories, because I felt like there was a little more of a balance there. And
there's a line.
And here it's just cruelty just for its own sake. And the kicking of the dog, that in particular, was just like, come on.
I was like, bro, no. And I'm like, for people with like dogs too, I was like, don't kick my dog. Like, that's not okay. It was interesting. The arc of the Boy of Steel starts you with the mentality that you're talking about with Rosenbaum, because he said, there's a line that says, do you think it would have been different if Lex grew up with your parents? And you start to go, oh, now we're thinking like Smallville. And we've even had those conversations in the Smallville universe. But then we go to issue 6 to get this. And you're like, no, if this is the story we're telling, it would not matter.
Right. Well, Lena even talks about, or is it Lena or Lori, the niece? I know, talks about
it's Lori
about him, tearing animals apart as a child. So it's like, now we're in serial killer behavior. That I felt like was too much. I mean, and this is what I said to Scott the last time. I guess ultimately it's a matter of preference. Right. Superman fans out there might be like, yeah, I want a Lex who's totally cruel and devoid of humanity. I mean, I don't know how many are in that camp. I mean, for myself at least, yeah, I want something that, you know, that I don't know, either I can relate to or that makes you care. I guess that's the thing. It's like, I don't care at all about this version of Lex.
No, I don't. And I think I prefer to have a damaged Lex Luthor with the knowledge that he is too far past redemption. Like he had, like, there were moments where he would have been able to get redemption, but he's too far. And now he's in Lionel's camp. So it's not that I think Boy of Steel takes too far, because I don't even think Lionel would necessarily do that. I think it's a different character almost. But I do like the Lex is unfortunately a damaged, traumatic character. He is the villain of the story, whether it's Shakespearean or modern comic books, that there has to be that antagonist. But I think there's a line, like you said.
Yes, I think the line between, you know, antagonism versus just unnecessary cruelty, I think there is that line there, and this story crosses it. But I guess the other piece about Lex being able to, right, because this is the whole thing. He continues to say it, especially in this round of stories, if it weren't for Superman, I would do this, this, and this. And in Up and Away, that post-Infinite Crisis storyline, Superman calls him out on that a couple of times. He's like, I was gone for a year. For anyone who doesn't remember, at the end of Infinite Crisis, he loses his powers. And so, like, if you read the 52 weekly series that came out after Infinite Crisis, like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, they're off the board. They're each doing their own thing, and the rest of the DC universe kind of, you know, picks up the pieces. And so Superman in that story is like, I was gone for a year. And what did you do? Like, all you did was plot your revenge. But going back to that Boy of Steel story and his ability to cure Lena and then the choice that he makes, I guess in my mind, people might disagree, and that's fine. In my mind, I don't really think Lex can do these things. Clearly, Boy of Steel disproves what I just said. But in my mind, it's like, and it's one of these things, I think we can all relate to this in some way, shape, or form. It's like, if there's something that you're scared of doing, or you don't know if you could do whatever, and there's something some excuse essentially. And I think for Lex, it's like Superman is that excuse. And whether he consciously knows he's incapable of the things that he claims or not, that I think could go either way. But I guess that's kind of always how I view it. It's like, no, I don't think you really can. But Superman is this excuse. But again, Boy of Steel disproves that. And I guess if Lex can't do these things, but he blames Superman, I think that makes him a little bit more relatable. The version that we get in Boy of Steel, where he can do these things, he literally can do them, and he chooses not to. He hates Superman that much. Yeah. It just makes him more sinister. So it has an effect, but I don't know that I care for the effect that it has.
Well, I think Up and Away is a good balance of the two. I think that's why I like it so much. And so an interesting analogy is, think about when there's like a presidential election, and the opponent is always complaining about, well, you know, for the last 4 years, they've done nothing but da. But when I get into office, I'm going to do this. And then they get into office and you don't see it. They do the same thing the last guy does. So that's in my brain what Lex constantly will say. Like, I would take care of Metropolis. I would make this the city of tomorrow if you weren't around. Well, he's not stopping you from doing that. He's just stopping bad guys and villains and sometimes you, but you could still be doing all of these things with your vast resources and corporations. Why don't you? And that's what he's doing while they're pummeling each other at the end of Up and Away, because they're both so weak. It's like just two gladiators just like taking big slugs at each other, and then also waxing poetic, you know, at each other, like, just like, why couldn't you do it? Bam, because you're the problem. Bam, and they keep hitting. It's hilarious, but an awesome moment.
It is. I took a screenshot as I was reading. So, and the basic setup for this is that we're really back into the renegade outlaw scientist with the underground lair, Luthor.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he has collected as much kryptonite as he can get his hands on, and the newly created Kryptonite Man. And he also has the Sunstone crystal that he stole from Superman during Infinite Crisis. And so he is channeling all this kryptonite energy through the Sunstone crystal to unearth what is actually Zod's ship that had been buried on Earth for decades. and it creates this huge crystal ship and tanks, and he's going to take out Metropolis. Like, it was funny because it's been so long since I read this. And at first I thought, I was like, oh, are we doing Superman Returns? Like with the real estate?
No.
I was like, no, like he just wants to take out Metropolis.
Which is weird too. There's more to that too.
I want to come back to that. And so ultimately Superman, fly, as much as there's kryptonite keeping him at bay, he is able to power through, and he flies through the ship, and he was able to grab Lex and the crystal, and everything falls apart. And they're falling, and there's this great moment where there's a quick beat, and then Lex just goes, I hate you.
Yeah.
As they're falling.
And then he doubles down. He's like, God, I hate you.
Yeah.
And I laughed out loud because I hadn't remembered that. And it is, if you watch it like in the panels, like they're in the air, they're hovering and they're falling. It's like, I hate you. It's just so great. Because ultimately, he doesn't need to say more than that. It's just so simple.
That's the thing, right? Like I know I don't need, as far as my, for all the Lex platitudes and the back and forth, it's like at the end of the day, he just hates this guy. Now, Superman doesn't say it back, but man, he feels it. And so one of the other things from Public Enemies that always stood out to me, and the animated movie actually packs a little bit more of a punch because you hear Tim Daly saying it, but when all of the metahumans are attacking and Grodd is controlling Solomon Grundy and Mongol, it's when Superman's fighting Mongol in particular. And at a certain point, as he punches Mongol, he's like, I'm sick of Lex Luthor. And you just feel the frustration. And that's what I'm saying. Like when I go back to, well, maybe Clark does bear some responsibility for how Lex turned out and this animosity. And last time with Scott, I talked about, just briefly, I mentioned that episode of Justice League Unlimited, The Clash, where Luthor goads Superman into a fight with Captain Marvel.
Oh, so good.
And, in that episode, it's like, there too, like it begs the question. It's like, is this, we know Superman's ultimately right and Cadmus is pulling the strings, but as far as what everyone else knows and even what Superman knows, it's like, is this just ego? Like you just can't get past this with Lex.
I remember vividly watching that episode going like, no, just stop. No, Superman, just stop. Just wait. Ask a question. And he's like, no, he goes, no, Lex is wrong and Lex is bad and I'm going to take it out. And then Shazam is there to just finish it. And I really, it was so interesting reading Up and Away because the first part of the arc, I loved Clark without powers. It was so fun to see that side. The spot that I was like, oh my gosh, is you see how pissed off Lex is when it's clear that Clark gets his powers back. Like you can see it. You can almost read it in the tone. Like Lex is infuriated. Like, are you effing kidding me? Like I thought we were done with this. Why is he back? And then we just go on with the story. But I loved that, like how pissed off Lex was.
Yeah, for sure. And like we've been saying, when it goes the other way too, when Clark has those feelings of anger, again, I think it shows his humanity. So I don't mind when we see things like that. Now, Public Enemies takes it pretty far where he contemplates killing Lex when Superman and Batman break into the White House. And my favorite part about that scene
when Batman's in the shadows in the back.
It's the best when Batman's like, I won't stop you.
I'm not gonna stop him. Yeah, it's like, wow. Usually Clark's the one that has to almost stop Batman.
Yeah,
and Batman's in the curtains going, nope.
And beyond that, he's like, I won't stop you. He goes, there are ways we can make this look like an accident, or better yet, that he disappeared. And it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah, he New Jersey'd him. He was like, there's the Meadowlands. Well, there's plenty of places they never find your body. I loved it.
And what's interesting though too is Lex's response to that, right? He's egging Superman on. He's like, do it, because this will be your undoing in the eyes of the public. I mean, that's the whole thing, especially with the evil businessman version, is that Lex occupies a certain place in the city, literally the highest point in the city until Superman soars above him, and figuratively in the hearts and minds of the people who now look at Superman as their hero instead of Lex. So the idea that Superman would lose that the same way Lex lost it when Superman arrived, that would be victory for Lex.
Well, and this is a segue to the quote that I think you want to bring up, which is, I wrote down, now the citizens of Metropolis will receive what they so richly deserve. And I'm going, whoa, what does he mean by that? Like, Lex has lost everything, and he always thought of himself as Metropolis's protector, I thought, but now it's like he's pissed. Like, no, I was above you, and you were supposed to respect me, and everything was fine because Superman was gone. But nope, now he's back, and you chose poorly, so I'm gonna off you all with my crystal weapon.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
It really is, and kind of just tying up one of the things that we were touching on. So at the end of Public Enemies, right? Mm-hmm. He's been ousted from the White House. He's in the war suit. He's crazy. He's been exposed, right? This facade that he's created has now been destroyed.
Yeah, there's no turning back.
Now, shortly after this, we head into Infinite Crisis, and we find out that Alexander Luthor from the pre-Crisis multiverse, he's in play, and he's been posing as Lex, pulling the strings of the secret society of villains, and our Lex is still running around in the war suit trying to make sense of everything, and at the end of Infinite Crisis, he finds and kills Alexander Luthor. And then in the pages of 52 and the beginning of Up, Up, and Away, he's able to use this doppelganger to escape the legal culpability for what he's done. Now, this was, I thought, a very interesting choice. And I guess it kind of pissed me off at the time because, again, I felt like, well, we're regressing. But anyway, the fact that, he gets away with it at the start of Up, Up, and Away, just like all of the other pre-crisis or post-crisis evil businessman installments. He's able to beat the rap. And, he's out there on the courthouse steps and he's talking to the people of Metropolis. And for a moment, it seems like, okay, we're putting the genie back in the bottle. And they could, that's the thing. They could have here. They could have had him get away with it and go back to running LexCorp status quo, but the people aren't buying it.
No, finally they're not buying it. And I think that's the connection. That usually he could either buy him off, kill him off. There's no witnesses, there's no tape. And I forget whether it's Public Enemies or Up, Up, and Away that Lois makes a comment like, make sure we get this on tape. Like make sure we record this. Like, now the people are paying attention and they want a record of what he says. Yeah. That's great.
And so that sets him off, right? Now it's not, now it's his goal is to destroy the city, which in we talked about this last time in For All Seasons #3, the Lex-centric issue. Yeah. He describes his relationship with the city as a love story. He goes, this is a love story between a man and a city. But like we've been talking about in these episodes, he's incapable of love. So the idea that this entity he loves and he feels has loved him in the past has now turned their back on him. Again, you never turn your back on Lex Luthor. His response is destruction, is death.
Yeah, they reboot this a little bit in the late 2010s when, remember, Lex is wearing the Superman suit and then he's protecting Metropolis. So they jettison this from the 2000s and they come back to this mentality. But again, we've talked about that in the past too. Like why he takes off that and he goes, you know what? No more. I'm not going to protect anymore. But it's so we see this in cycles, which I kind of like. I mean, we come back and forth from this over each decade for readers, I think, too.
Yeah, I agree. And like I said before, the fact that again, we're not even into the New 52 territory, but I know you're the New 52 and then Rebirth is what you're referring to. But, for these stories in particular, again, the earlier history does still remain intact. And he even says, I think it's during the Boy of Steel arc where he references his quote unquote suit and tie years.
Yes.
So this idea, like now it's being spun as like this was a chapter in his story. And now, he's going to be the outlaw. So yeah, like I said, what had kind of annoyed me in the past, now I can get on board with as an evolution of the character that's bringing back these other elements, but we're getting a little bit of a different spin.
Don't you love, though, you brought up the Silver Age, bringing back some of that. What I really enjoyed about these arcs was it does bring back this. Lex is not just a megalomaniac businessman. He's a gifted scientist. He's a genius scientist. I liked that. That's what I loved about the Silver Age Lex. That first and foremost, he was a scientific genius, and that's what made him such a threat. Yeah,
and I guess there were some hints of this in the 90s. I guess the Final Night storyline comes to mind where
a little bit,
where they have to where Lex helps against the Sun Eater. And so you see a little bit more, because really from post-crisis, really in the 80s and 90s, it was really, he had scientists working for him, which,
correct,
like
Cadmus or Dabney Donovan or something like that. Yeah.
Right. And so just as a side note, for all the talk that Scott and I did about the evil businessman version, I don't know if we said this explicitly, but all women, well, not all women, but primarily women, especially in those early Byrne issues, which, and we talked about how he abused his position with at least one of the scientists who worked for him in Superman #2. But beyond that he's surrounded by these female employees, shows you a lot about who he is. As a side note that actually relates to what we're talking about now, I did take a look at the episode of Smallville from season 4 called Bound. And it's the one that guest stars Kobe Smulders, pre How I Met Your Mother, Kobe Smulders. We get a glimpse into Lex's womanizing ways. I mean, it's not to the level of the Byrne Lex, who's really forcing these women into sexual relationships with him. But he's picking up women and quickly discarding them and setting them a pair of earrings as a sort of a trophy or whatever. For their time with him. And it really kind of colors the way Clark sees him too, as like this whole other side of Lex that he didn't know. So it was just kind of interesting. Again, not in the same vein or to the same extent as we got in those Byrne issues, but this idea again of Lex's treatment of women. This was another instance, of that. But where was I going with this?
You're talking about scientist. We're talking about the scientists he surrounds himself with.
Thank you. So Final Night, we got a little bit of that scientific mind coming back, but still primarily the businessman. I feel like Birthright was really now our pivot back into the scientifically minded Lex, even though, as we've talked about on the show before, Birthright as the definitive origin of Superman unfortunately never took hold, but still stands as a great read today.
It is one of my favorite things to go back and read, not just because of the artwork, but because I think it's such a cool diversion in some ways. Like you said, it was supposed to be the new origin, but no, it's not going to. But Mark Waid definitely has, I think, the character's voice down so well.
Yes. Well, so now let me ask you. So pre-crisis, he's a scientist. Post-crisis, he's a businessman. And then really from Birthright forward, and we see this reinforced in Secret Origin, he's both. He's the scientist businessman. Do you like that amalgam? Do you prefer one over the other?
I like the amalgam. The reason I like Birthright is because I almost think it's like the best of both worlds, from Smallville Lex to comic book Lex. Like, I think we actually see both veins, and I forget specifically when Birthright was written, but I feel like it was during the Smallville run.
Yes, it was.
So it's very interesting because I know Mark Waid is a big fan of the show also. So you could definitely see, like, I'm trying to infuse this tone that we're seeing in the show, but also throw in, like, there's almost hints of All-Star Superman inside Birthright a little bit too, when you get to this science aspect and Clark and Lex being scientific together, and all the tests that Lex is giving Clark to see, wait, is this guy just a farm boy or does he actually know his stuff? I love the scene with the astronomy, and he sees the book on the shelf and he goes, oh, okay, let's see if this farmhand knows what he's talking about. I love it. I loved all of it.
Yes. All right. Well, I guess this is as good a point as any to talk about one of the other, major aspects of pre-crisis Lex that came back here, this past with Clark in Smallville. Now, of course, we see it obviously on the Smallville TV show most prominently, but also in Birthright and in Secret Origin.
Yeah.
A major difference in these stories versus pre-crisis is that pre-crisis we had Clark as Superboy. So they had this past that then continued on into the present day between Lex and Superman. I feel like there's I don't see it as a problem, but I feel like the writers of Smallville and Birthright and Secret Origin saw a problem that they felt they needed to try to solve. And that problem is, well, if Clark and Lex have this history together, how does Lex not know that Clark is Superman?
Right.
And I feel like the fixes for that in almost every instance almost make it one of those things where like it defeats the purpose. And I don't know that it's necessarily worth it. And that might be a little bit too far, but like I've talked about this before. I don't want to belabor the point, but the fact that at the end of Smallville, they erase not just Lex's memory of Clark, not just the past few years, literally every memory he's had. I mean, it's no matter how you cut it, it's a ridiculous end for the character. And it's one of those things where I love the scene between Clark and Lex in the burned out mansion earlier in the finale. It's like, man, this sets up a great dynamic. The whole thing with Destiny together on different sides. And he knows that Clark is Kal-El, but he's encouraging him to become Superman because he knows that they're going to push each other to be great men. It's like, oh my God, like this is the dynamic I've always wanted. I never use the, sports metaphors, but it's like, we were so close to the end zone here. It's like all we needed in the Luthor Corp towers at the end was for him to kill Tess and look out over the city. Done. Like we were so close, and man, did they fumble it with that memory wipe. And it drives me nuts to this day.
The memory wipe, and we're not going to get back into the Donnerverse, but the memory wipe, that is like a close second to It Was All a Dream. It's like the end of like Dallas for all those people that watched those like in the 80s, like any sort of show where the show goes off the rails and the writers are like, oh shit, it was a dream. Like, just do that. Oh, it's such a cop-out. And my opinion is I wish the Birthright, Smallville, Secret Origin, Clark Lex was a definitive. I hate. It's a strong word to use. I hate the Superboy idea that Clark was Superboy way back. There's so many incredible scenes, and I wrote a note at the end of Birthright was Lex's ego won't allow him to think Clark is Superman. That's how he doesn't know, because he's so smart. He doesn't always believe that anybody could be as smart as him, and he says nothing good will ever come out of this hick town except for Lex Luthor. So it's like hiding in plain sight. It's hiding inside his ego.
Right.
It's easy to do. Like you said, oh my gosh, I wish they would have just kept that going. And maybe we'll see. I don't know. Maybe they'll retcon it in the Smallville animated series they're doing. I don't know.
Hopefully that happens. And hopefully if they do, I mean, I know Rosenbaum was not a fan of the mind wipe at the end. He said as much in interviews. So I wouldn't be surprised if maybe that's something that's undone. But so again, at the end of Smallville, it drove me so crazy, especially since, and look, I don't know if there was any sort of corporate mandate from Warner Brothers or they just took it upon themselves. I don't know, but it was such a baffling choice, and it undermined Lex's whole. I mean, that's the thing. The
whole 10 years just shot.
Yeah, I mean, I have to put that out of my mind, otherwise it renders everything we're talking about with Lex moot. But anyway, so that's and the reason why. Here's the thing: the reason why I say it's a problem that doesn't really exist, but they see it as a problem, and I've been saying this so many times on the show. I think it works fine if Lex knows. Especially if you have the foundation that you have from Smallville, where it's like, no, there's a bedrock of friendship there. He's not going to blow up his identity. It's power that he has over him. There's any number of spins you can put on him.
It's very doable, and that's frustrating with me too. For reading Birthright and Secret Origin and these, I enjoy them for the connections they make. Like, I don't always think about these as broad scope stories, but more like little nuggets of, oh, that's a really interesting way to think about why Lex is Lex. So there's another quote I wrote down was, I wish his parents were more concerned with social and moral development than the financial and business side of things. It's just such an interesting, what if those added character traits were deemed important to the Luthor family? Like, would he change?
Right.
That's why I love these books, because it's like, oh man, interesting. Like it's a different spin on a character we think we know well.
Yeah, no, and so that's the thing. Like ultimately, I like the idea of a past between them and Smallville, but I've yet to see it realized the way I would want it to be. And this, they're not my stories to tell, so it's fine. But
you're so selfish, Anthony. I tell you.
But I always feel like we're so close. Now I'm going to come back to Birthright, but Secret Origin was one of those ones where I'm like, well, what are we even doing here? Because
It was okay.
It was, but especially with the Lex piece of it, where he has a couple of interactions with Clark, with both Birthright and Secret Origin, Lex's time in Smallville is very limited. And again, I think that's pointed towards this idea of, well, how do we, make it that he doesn't know in the future? So it's like this brief visitation in Smallville.
Yeah.
But with Secret Origin, the few encounters they have, or the couple that we even see, they feel very perfunctory. There's nothing about them that really shows us anything, or I don't know, maybe that's too harsh, but I just don't feel like there's anything that's really formative in those encounters.
No, they're very trite. They're almost I don't want to say throwaway. That really sounds bad about somebody else's work, but it's what you would almost expect. I don't feel it's anything special or new. I mean, I was curious about the timing, about what was going on in the news at the time, because I did get a hint of a little bit of political connections too. So I had wrote down, like, Lex is trying to convince the world that Superman is not only a menace, but an alien that we should hate. And it made me kind of go like, oh, does that sound familiar to, anything, how our country was talking about immigrants and other things and that kind of stuff. So I was seeing it as more of a social connection, like a social commentary in some cases, but I didn't really see anything, I don't say redeeming, but nothing that really added to my understanding of Lex and his relationship with Clark.
Right. I guess the point that I'm trying to get at is, if we're going to have a past with Lex and Clark in Smallville, it should mean something.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree.
And so on Smallville, absent the memory wipe, it does. Like, again, if you cut that last piece out, what's been set up there, it's like, wow, we have a great dynamic that'll there's so much you can mine from this moving forward.
And I think Birthright does that too, though, because there are connections that you do also see. I think that there's a scene where Lex says, will I ever fit in here? And then Clark has this moment where, I can't really tell him why I feel this way, but gosh, I want to tell Lex, I totally understand what that feels like. And there's like a kindredness between the two of them. And to me, that was important. Like, that was like, oh, that needed to be talked about, because now we as Superman fans are resonating as a Lex fan too, which I was like, that's an important moment in comic book writing.
For sure. And Birthright did a vastly better job, in my opinion, than Secret Origin. Yeah. Again, like I said, the Secret Origin encounters where, Clark and Lex meet at the fair right before the tornado, and, Clark's wearing his glasses, and Lex is like, do you read a lot, or,
Yeah.
So, they have that encounter, and then another one in the library at school, I think, where Lex talks about, the small town, and I'm going to go to Metropolis, and Clark is reading the book that Lex had been selling about, is there life out there? And Lex says, oh, there is. And, in both Birthright and Secret Origin, we now have this take on Lex where he's or interested in extraterrestrial life, this astrobiologist. Right. So now we're getting into that. And I want to come back to what you were saying about this view of Superman as alien, the xenophobia. I want to get back to that. But again, there's just those couple of encounters in Secret Origin. And then when Lex meets Clark later on, and Clark says, like, oh, we met in Smallville, and Lex is like, oh yeah, how could I forget those glasses? It's like, what was this for? Like, I just don't feel like there's enough there, and I don't know, maybe other stories could have fleshed it out. I don't know. But so there's that. And then in Birthright, again, I love Birthright, and I really, for the most part, enjoyed Wade's updated take on Clark and Lex in Smallville. I think you're right, seeing the parallels between the two of them. Like, they're both outsiders. We know why Clark is, but for Lex, he's so smart that people don't understand him, and he can't relate to them, and vice versa. And he sees this look on their faces, right? This fear, this distrust, or whatever you want to call it. And when he's showing Clark this experiment in at his house, and it involves a meteor rock, and and Clark writhes in pain, and Lex mistakes that for that same look that he's seen on all of those people. It's as if Clark turned his back on him.
Yep.
And he, he turns on Clark. And so that I thought that played really well. I mean, it was a little tough. You're right. You see a lot of similarities to the Smallville show, but this version of Lex is different. They feel even closer in age, although Lex is older, but they feel closer in age. And, this is not a personable Lex. Like, that's the thing.
No,
Rosenbaum's Lex was very personable, very charming.
Charming, yes.
And this Lex was played very differently. So even then and now reading it, like, it's a little tough because we're so close to that Smallville territory.
Yeah.
But which is fine.
It's almost like if you took the charm of Rosenbaum out and you put in a more like cold, standoffish approach, that would be Birthright. Like the scene where Lex has to like, oh, okay, you want to see deduction? I'll tell you deduction. And then he goes through the class, like everything about the teacher, sleeping with the gym teacher, like all these things. And the looks that they're giving him, like you said, is like, oh my God, who is this dude? And it was very high school. It wasn't like any other adult would be like, whoa, this kid is above everything. But at that level, they're like, you're weird. Like, it's like the kid approach to, you're different. I don't like you. You're weird. And I felt more sad for Lex in Birthright, and not like in Smallville, like not in the, oh, they could be tight if only, but like the scene where poor Lex has the metal detector that's supposed to pick up things, and then it, like, well, because it's useless, and he just goes nuts, and he wasted all this time, he thinks, but he did it, and you're like, oh, damn it, Lex.
Right.
Like, I felt more bad for him in that relationship. It's shown in Birthright, but I really liked it. I think because I feel it was needed.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think for the most part it played well. But again, going back to this larger idea that I'm still wrestling with is when, Lex leaves Smallville in Birthright. Yeah. Clark explains like the next day, like the movers came and the pavers and like salted the earth. It was like he was never there. And there's no record of Lex's time in Smallville. And when Lex meets Clark in the present day, he Clark is like, oh, I know you from Smallville. Like, he does not acknowledge it. And it's like, I don't know, is Lex's mind so powerful? Did he I mean, I don't think that's what we're supposed to come away with. I think he knows he spent this time in Smallville, but he's not acknowledging it.
But I think it's also ego. I think that's another thing to Lex's ego, where in that instance, if he admits he was ever in Smallville, people could go like, oh, wait, why were you in this little nowhere nothing town when you're saying you're Lex Luthor and you're a member of the Luthor family? I think he's not like, he didn't retcon it from his own memory. He's refusing to allow others to ever think he'd be so far beneath them.
Right.
I think it had to be there. He had to ignore it because of his ego.
I think you're right. But again, I guess the sort of what I bump up against is, if not to
Anthony will never be happy, listeners.
No, I'm happy about a lot of stuff, and I've gotten happier about so many things, but I do feel strongly about this. I guess, I mean, everything you're saying makes sense, and I think that is a perfectly reasonable explanation, but it's like, if then we don't have those moments between Clark and Lex where their past is acknowledged, discussed in some way, comes up. It just sort of feels like a missed opportunity. It's like they have this past, they had this really traumatic experience, and this moment where whatever friendship they had fell away.
I really think that you are just still damaged from season 10 of Smallville. I think that's what it comes down to.
I think that,
you know what I mean? Like, to a certain extent, that we've taken such ownership of that universe that we're like, yes, I like everything that you're saying. Give me more of that. And then to just go, never mind. I'm not totally being serious. Like, we're almost like, why would you do that when you set us up for success? Like, you ruined those characters for us.
Yeah, no, that's totally it. Like, there's a dynamic that I feel has been set up multiple times that we've never really seen pay off. That is my frustration with it. So now, I don't think that's a secret anymore at this point, but, Mark Waid is doing a follow-up to Birthright. Mm-hmm. And I believe it's going to be fairly, Clark and Lex centric. So, maybe what I'm talking about now, maybe this will be something that pays off here, where, again, like to your point, I mean, yeah, I do think Lex remembers his time in Smallville. He's not acknowledging it, but maybe there's something that will force him to. We'll get some of those moments that I've been longing for. That's all I'm saying.
So when you post this, are you friends with Mark Waid on Facebook?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we need to do a deliberate share and tell him the minute mark that we are talking right now and say, Mark, we are asking for you to please fix the end of Smallville for us and make this finally happen. On behalf of all Superman fans everywhere, please do that.
Yeah, for sure. So, while we're talking about the time in Smallville and just the Luthor family tree and everything, and what he knows and what he acknowledges about his past, in the post-crisis iteration, there was a lot of mystery surrounding where Lex came from. And there was that unauthorized biography I talked about with Scott, where there's this reporter who figures out that, Lex grew up in suicide slum with, alcoholic, abusive parents. And he, messed up their car and took out this life insurance policy. And that was how he got his start. So there's this, which I thought was kind of interesting, this idea of like a mystery surrounding, where Lex came from. And so now in both Birthright and Secret Origin, same basic idea of, of his father in particular, with him in Smallville. In Birthright, it's established that he comes from money, and we only see his father like in one panel when Clark goes to the door. It looks very similar to Lionel.
Yeah.
But that's as much as we get. And after the explosion, following Lex's experiment, he does see his father, pleading for help in the fire, and clearly Lex doesn't help him. And that's the end of that version of Lex's father, which really called to mind the season 1 finale of Smallville.
Yes.
When the tornado hits the town and causes destruction at the mansion, and Lionel is lying there with a big column about to crash into him, pleading for help. And one of Lex's earliest moments of that darkness coming out, where he hesitates, and ultimately he saves him. But there's that moment where you're like, the blood on his face, and it's like, is he really going to let him die?
Yeah. I don't know which version I like, whether Lionel is like, whether Lex comes from money, or if Lex comes from, like in Secret Origin, the drunk farmer. Because I think there's merit to both of those possibilities. That Lex is erasing his traumatic past of either Lionel or the abusive drunk father. Both work in trauma. So he's trying to escape one of those two things, which works really, really well. I think it's interesting to me too, like if the father is kind of this belligerent alcoholic farmer and Lex is just this genius, I think that tells a very interesting possible story also of success. And that's why he also wants to erase his past and not admit that he knows Clark or remember Smallville, because that would admit that he has a past that is hard and a little more lower class than he'd like to admit.
Right. Which of course, totally plays into the whole ego of the character. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know that I can even say I'm split, because I'm so beholden to the Smallville version, and the Lionel Lex dynamic was so compelling that I do gravitate towards that. I mean, it also depends on the story you're telling. And with Smallville, we spent so much time there, and we had so far to go before Lex became who he would become. And having Lionel as the businessman allowed access to, a whole other world for Lex and the characters.
Yeah.
But, just in terms of character, but also just plot. I mean, it facilitated, a lot of things that needed to transpire on the show, that there was this access that, one of the characters had.
And I think that's why I enjoy, like, some people get really frustrated when they even hear that we have a mini series coming out that could possibly rewrite. I don't know if I get as much upset as more as I'm intrigued by, like, all right, so what are they going to do that's different? That they're not, I don't think anybody is, unless it's stated we're going to redo a rebirth or something like that. I am very interested as to what we can do more with a character that's been around for 80 years. Like, I've never thought of it that way. I always appreciate it. And we're seeing a lot of that in like the DC Black Label stuff that has replaced a lot of our Elseworlds or What If kind of stories. But so yeah, it's interesting. So any of the stuff we read, I don't, especially like Secret Origin and Birthright, I don't dislike any of it. I just don't jive with some of the ways they've had takes on things.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, and then ultimately, as far as which kind of Lionel we want Lex to come from,
like, what do you think? Which one do you like? You're a Smallville person, like you said.
Yeah, I just think it's ultimately more interesting, and it gives them more places to go. I don't disagree with your point that there's trauma in both, and both can inform how he becomes who he becomes. And I mean, in fairness, if we're going with this track of like he's burying his past in Smallville, then yeah, him coming from the alcoholic farmer,
right?
Whose brakes he tries to cut, it's like, okay, I guess that tracks a little bit better. But yeah, I don't know if it's the Lionel of Smallville. I think it's a lot richer, pun intended. I think it gives you more places to go.
I think it gives you more places to go also if you put on one side of it Jonathan Kent and on the other side of it Lionel Luthor.
Yes.
I think then you're going, okay, that's a very interesting barometer of putting Lex in the middle. In which way is he going to go? Like which father does he want to have and which son does he want to be? That is where I find interest in the Smallville approach.
Yeah, totally. And again, I agree. I think Birthright did a great job of showing this kinship between Clark and Lex and both feeling like outsiders. And part of that in Birthright was that Lex came from money. Clark specifically is talking about that with Jonathan. And on the Smallville show, and we haven't even really talked about this yet, but the baldness, right? Lex's baldness is used differently across these iterations.
Yeah.
In the Silver Age, of course, he blames Superboy for causing his baldness, and it's like, the vanity, the ego, and that sets off this animosity between them. And it's, again, it feels a little silly now, but that was the version at the time. And then post-Crisis, when we meet him in Man of Steel, he's balding, and soon enough the hair is gone, but it's not so much of a sticking point for the character. But Smallville was interesting because it is this traumatic moment during the meteor shower where he loses his hair, and he's not like in the Silver Age, he's a teenager or early 20s, maybe even when that happens. But on Smallville, he's a little kid and talks about that on the show, how growing up, as a kid, coming traumatic from money and being bald and just looking different, there are flashbacks to him getting bullied at the Excelsior Academy and all of that. So that really informed, I think, a lot of who he became and the way people viewed him and the way he, responded.
Well, it's like he was the first meteor freak.
Yeah.
Like I think that's why he resonated so much about wanting to find out why. Like, why was he put through that? What caused all of that? Which leads him to Clark, which makes it so much more interesting, I think.
Yeah. Now you mentioned again about the alien, the idea of the alien, and you certainly see in these stories more than what had come before. I feel you do feel more of that xenophobia, and especially in Secret Origin, Lex has a line to General Lane about how Superman's interest in Lois is unnatural.
Oh yeah,
and even in the Up and Away, I mean, he's constantly calling Superman alien, and again, you just feel it, the hatred dripping. What stood out to me was in Birthright. What's funny is that so much of the last third or so of that story is Lex, tricking the populace into thinking that Superman is this advanced scout from his alien race. But Lex himself, his reasoning is that he had been searching for extraterrestrial life his whole life.
Right.
And when he finally found it, Superman, not in so many words, turned his back on him. He humiliated him.
Yeah.
Right. So as much as Lex was putting forth this idea, like we have to fear the alien, it was really just this personal slight that he was feeling. Very interesting.
Lex kind of did I have my arms open. I want to be friends. Like, we are friends. And then it's like, no, like, it's no mistake that there is a common thread of feeling betrayed. Lex is the ultimate betrayer because he knows how it feels.
And I like a Lex who feels betrayed far more than I like a Lex who hates the outsider.
Correct. I like that a lot better, and I feel that that's a little more real. I think that's a little more like justifiable almost. And I like that a lot better than the egomaniac or crazy amped up venomy kryptonite poison Lex.
Yeah, and no, I'm with you on that. And, in the next episode, we're going to talk more about what I'm calling Lex, the ideologue, and the stories that deal with Lex, who truly has a philosophical objection to a being with this much power. But even that is different than fearing someone from another planet. Now, there was one odd Smallville thing that I've never really liked, and I don't feel like it tracks. And it's the end of season 7, Michael Rosenbaum's final episode before he came back for the series finale, when he learns that Clark is this traveler that Lionel and the rest of the Veritas group had been looking for all those years.
Is that in the Arctic or no?
Yep.
Yeah.
And they have the final scene of season 7 is this showdown, this final face-off between Clark and Lex. Yep. And Lex knows that Clark is Kal-El the Traveler. And it's this moment we've been building toward. And we have this face-off. And yet again, Lex talks about how Clark turned his back on him. But there's this point, like Lex, we talk about the maniacal Lex. There's an air about him in the scene that felt a little unhinged. And that was kind of hard for me to kind of reconcile with that version of Lex. And Lex literally says to Clark, I don't know the exact quote, but he says, like, you pose as a mild-mannered farm boy, but secretly you're an alien plotting our demise. And it was that last part that was like,
that's the part I don't like.
That was like, where, like, you have plenty of reasons to hate Clark at this point, but that's not one of them. What makes you think that? That always stood out to me as an outlier.
I totally am with you on that one, because I'm fine with Lex being unhinged because it's the culmination of the betrayal. It's the, are you freaking kidding me? I was right. And like, if you really go back through all of the times Clark's lied, that would make you so pissed. But never in all of that did we feel that Lex was a xenophobe or an alien hater. Like, no, like that was, I think, just that's bad writing. That's just a bad line.
Yeah, I think that was a little bit of a slip there. Again, I don't mind stories where Lex plays on the xenophobia of others, but I don't need him to have it himself. So I guess that's where I draw the line, I suppose.
Yeah.
Now,
I love that episode, actually. And part of me was hoping that they didn't go where they went. I think season 8 could have been really cool if Lex then knows, and that's how we deal with things. But it's okay. That's another episode.
Every dynamic on the show got better and more interesting when the character learned the secret. And I don't think this would have been any different.
Correct.
But that is what it is. Now, I had asked you ahead of time, if you want to compare notes on like our top 5 Lex moments on Smallville. Are there any that we haven't hit yet that were on your list that we haven't talked about?
The only one we didn't really talk about was Lexmas.
Ah, such a good one.
It just makes me so happy. And it also makes me so sad. That's why it's such to me, an incredibly written episode. It's one of my favorite episodes because it's a wonderful life. Like, what if this worked out the way Lex could have imagined it or loved it? And it's heartbreaking to me at the end. But I just think we see, again, another what if Lex wasn't the villain of the story? Which is still, I know that's not necessarily what we're talking about, but it's one of my favorite Lex moments because you see the possibility of Lex being a force for good and how he could be an equal to Clark and not an antithesis.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, what's heartbreaking about that episode is, he just has the wrong takeaway, right? Because in this vision, he has turned his back on Lionel and the family fortune, and then he's not able to save Lana's life when she has complications during childbirth, right?
And when he wakes up, he learns the wrong lesson.
Right.
That's what makes me sad. Yeah.
That's the thing. It's the tragedy of this guy of not having the right takeaway and not being able to get out of his own way, of injecting himself with kryptonite after he lost his hand and then his life to kryptonite poisoning. It's just like,
right. Right. Yeah. Okay. So do you want to talk about John Cryer?
Yes. The last thing I want to say, because we've basically hit on all of my Smallville moments.
Nice.
The one thing though I will say is in season 3, there was this whole arc where Lex learned that Lionel had killed Lionel's parents for the insurance money. So basically what Lex would do post-crisis, they gave Lionel that origin. And in order to escape this, Lionel has Lex committed to an asylum and subjects him to this electroshock therapy that erases his short-term memory. And one of my moments is certainly the end of that episode, Shattered, and they played the Hurt cover by Johnny Cash.
Yeah.
And you see, Lionel looking in at Lex at the straitjacket, haunting. And then, so I guess I'm kind of cheating and having two. But then the other one is in that Memoriam episode that I talked about, where Lex recovers a lot of his memories, including that memory of Lillian killing Julian. He has this heart-to-heart with Lionel where he reveals all of this. Yeah. And oh man, it breaks your heart for Lex. And that's why I didn't want to leave without saying this, where Lionel is like, if I had known that it wasn't you who killed your brother, if I had known, things would have been so different between us. And Lex is like, you might have actually loved me. And it's like, oh my God, it's so heartbreaking. And again, goes so far to inform everything that Lex does. And not that this is one of my top moments, but in that episode where Lex kills Lionel, Clark talks to Chloe at the end of it. And he's like, how could somebody kill their own father?
Yeah.
And Chloe says, total absence of love. And that's the thing with this guy. He didn't receive it at the time when he needed it as a kid, and doesn't know now how to give or receive it as an adult. And that's why everything falls apart.
And people ask constantly, because I'm so vested in the comic world, in my life, in my family. And this discussion is another perfect example of like, we learn character and life lessons from stories like these constantly. They're modern day parables. Like, it's learn your lesson from these stories, kids, because this is how you can really see your life unfolding if you're not careful. It's a lesson to be learned. And that's what I always see it as. It's veiled in capes and crusaders, but it's still things that we need to think about in life.
Totally. No, well said. All right. So John Cryer as like now.
You mean Lenny?
Yeah, Lenny. Man, there's a lot to say, but I don't want to forget this because this is kind of interesting. And I want to pose this question to you. So Tyler from the Krypton Report podcast, he's been on the show before.
Yep.
And he said something that has stuck with me that's kind of interesting. He said in his headcanon, not that this is literally the case, but that you can sort of look at John Cryer's Lex as Michael Rosenbaum's Lex a bit, a few years down the road.
Yes.
Does that track? Again, not literally, but that at least in a spiritual sense.
I will kind of agree with that. Yeah, I think I wrote down, is he an older Smallville Lex? But it's very interesting. This could be John Cryer's take because he worked with Gene Hackman. That, like, you see very little glimpses of Gene Hackman. But then, as much as I hate to say this, you do see a dash of Kevin Spacey every now and then too. Because I think that John Cryer, like any actor, is going to go back and watch, like, as a method person, we're going to find out, like, what's the backstory on this character. But I do think if I had to combine two, it's Rosenbaum and Hackman. He's trying to portray. But I think from a continuity standpoint, do you think that it is like supposed to be older Rosenbaum?
I mean, not in a strict continuity sense, but I think at least in a spiritual sense, yeah. I think that you can kind of line them up more or less.
Like that, what it could have ended up happening. Yeah.
Right. Now, the big question first, do you like this iteration of Lex?
I was thinking, well, and that should be the answer there too. Like, if I had to think about it too long, I kind of like the take I don't love John Cryer necessarily. I mean, I think he's fine. I think I also have a hard time with like what John Cryer's also done in like past roles that gets in the way of me seeing him like really authentically as a Lex Luthor. Like whether it's like 2.5 Men or like is it Ducky from Pretty in Pink? Like it just throws me a little bit. It takes me out of it, I guess, too much. I actually, though, I think some of the writing and the stuff that we find in the episode is really cool and gives you a few gotcha moments that I didn't expect. But I don't particularly love him as one of my Lex Luthor.
Fair enough. I mean, it's not the hill that I'm going to die on trying to convince you otherwise. I remember when they announced him, and yes, you have the connection to Superman 4 that he played, Lenny, Lex's nephew. But I remember when they announced him, and I watched 2.5 Men. I watched all of 2.5 Men. I watched the Charlie Sheen and the Ashton Kutcher years. So I watched a lot of John Cryer on that show. And, it was, my initial reaction was not a positive one, and it didn't help when they released I remember the first photo that they released of him with his beard and bald head and in his prison garb and like standing at the door. And I was like, I don't know. Watching the episode, I was pleasantly surprised. And just for a quick bit of context, I mean, I watched Supergirl, the CBS and then CW series with Melissa Benoist. I watched that. I watched the first 5 seasons regularly as it aired. And I started watching the 6th and final season, and I got a couple of episodes in, and I couldn't do it anymore. So I've never finished the show, but I know how it ends. And I know that Lex continues to be an antagonist until the very end. But anyway, so I was watching these Lex episodes as they were coming out. And again, I was pleasantly surprised when I watched, which was great. So he ended up being a better Lex than I thought he would be.
Yeah.
Would he be at the top of my list? No, but I think he did a solid job and served his role well in that capacity on that show.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's a good actor. Don't let me say that. I think that he also really nails the manipulative side of Lex Luthor.
Yeah. That
he does fool you and you really can't tell. I think he is similar. I love Tom Cavanaugh on The Flash. Like the Harrison Wells vibe is very resonant in his take on Lex Luthor, that you're like, oh, wait, maybe he's going to be good. Like, did we miss something? Oh, nope, he's bad. Like, so I like his delivery. I really enjoyed like the story about Lena's real mom. I think that got me hard. And then I was like, oh God, nope, he's Lex Luthor. Why did I get fooled by him again? I shouldn't have been fooled. I do like that. He's very charismatic and calculating still. I think that was well portrayed, but maybe just I haven't seen enough of it. I think if I watched some more, that I would enjoy it more.
Would you? I don't know. I'm thinking of my.
You're like, no, would you, Bertie?
No, it's not even a reflection of you. It's more like I'm thinking about my own arc with the show, and because I definitely was pleasantly surprised with him initially, and I think I kind of I came to find him grating as we went on. I don't know how much that had to do with him though. I really think the show went downhill. Again, there's a reason I stopped watching with like
I would agree.
18 episodes to go.
Well, like I told you, like we stopped at, I think, episode 4 of season 4, so I didn't even get to this point, and so maybe I made a good choice.
I think, I mean, performance aside, I think what I appreciate, especially now going through this whole process about that take on Lex, are the echoes of a lot of other interpretations. Yes. And not that I think that always has to be the case, but there were a lot of fun nods. And like we were saying, I think you definitely see a lot of shades of the Smallville Lex, and in that charisma and manipulation in particular, I think you see a lot of it there. He comes to don, it's actually at the start of the next episode after the one that we watched, but he dons the green war suit. So you get that nod. In the episode we watched, when he makes his big play, and we find out that Eve Tessmacher has been working for him all along, and he summons her, and it's Miss Tessmacher. Again, you get that right out of the Gene Hackman performance. Otis is his other henchman, right, from those
I know.
movies. So I think there's a lot that, that they pull from other incarnations, and they give you, kind of that interesting blend. He definitely had been that businessman before
Right.
he was exposed, and was then the outlaw Lex that we've had in Pre and now in these stories.
I like that they also had him dying of kryptonite poisoning. Like, I think that there's a continued arc that they didn't try to change. There's like, no, we're going to stay true to that idea. So I would say it's easy way for me to sum it up is I appreciated it. I didn't dislike it. I appreciated it. It was fine.
I don't know, to an extent, how do I put this? I think the show did better by its Lex than by its Superman, but they're similar in the sense that
I would agree with you. They do. They treat Superman much better in Superman and Lois than they did on
1,000%.
Supergirl.
Yeah, for sure. But like I've always said, their Superman was playing a supporting role to Supergirl. And in that context, it worked well enough. But yeah, it's a far cry from the heights we've reached with Superman and Lois.
Yeah.
But I guess a similar thing here, the meat of this show, especially season 2 on when they brought on Lena, was that Kara-Lena relationship. It wasn't about Lex. So
right.
Again, he has a very specific function to serve, and I think he serves it well. What's your take on Lena, though, in this show or just generally?
Well, it's interesting because, again, I didn't finish it. I really do like Lena. And I think, if anything, the reason I would push through and slog through like 3 more seasons of 22 episodes is I do want to see where her arc lands. Like, because it's very interesting, similar to the Clark Lex issue of secrets and betrayal. If she tells Lena that she's Kara, there's going to be a fallout. Like, I mean, I don't know what happens. I've purposely not been spoiled because if I ever do decide to spend hours of my life catching up, I am curious. I am really curious how that falls out. So,
all right. Well, I won't spoil anything.
Good.
Well, but let me.
Is it worth me doing it? That's my question for you. Is it worth me bothering Lana to watch it with me and finish it? Fast forward. Can I fast forward through things?
You know what? I would recommend watching the 100th episode.
Okay.
And this isn't really giving anything away, big picture wise, but the premise of that episode, they bring back a slightly different version of Mxyzptlk, and it's kind of what we wished Smallville had done. A what if Clark had told Lex. It's kind of like that, but you sort of get to see it play out in different scenarios.
Oh, all right. I'll watch it.
So I would say watch that. And if you're like, oh, I want more, then go for it. But you might be satiated with that. So I would kind of say watch the 100th episode.
Because my thing with the show has never been casting, actually. I enjoy the people they've put in the roles. It's just, I think... I've always, again, we've talked about this on other podcasts. I bet Supergirl would be an amazing show if it was a 10 or 11 episode season. But that goes for most shows at this point. So,
yeah, no. Look, I love Smallville, but it goes for Smallville too. If those 22 episodes had been 10 or 12, it would have been amazing. Oof. It would have been even better than it was. But it is what it is. But I guess the thing I wanted to ask with even without knowing where the show goes, but because I guess even to the point you've seen Lillian Luthor, right, on Supergirl,
yes. Mm-hmm.
And when Lena is initially introduced, or in one of her early episodes, I believe we see a flashback to Lionel bringing Lena home, and then in the episode that we watched, you get the revelation because she thought she was adopted by the Luthors, and we get this revelation. Lex tells her the story, which is apparently true, that Lionel was her father.
Yeah.
And again, Lillian and Lex and Lena, is it too many Luthors? Lionel doesn't remain in play, but Lillian, Lena, Lex, it's a very different dynamic to have like that family unit.
Well, and I think the writers were trying to take a John Glover and do it in Brenda Strong, like with Lillian. Like, we need somebody to do this to Kara that was this to, or this to Lena. Because Lex's character on Smallville worked so well because of Lionel. So I think they're just thinking, we need a Lionel. We can't have Lionel, so let's do Lillian. This is a very woman power show. Let's continue to do that.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think that does explain it. I don't know how much I
don't love
loved
it.
having.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it just created a whole different vibe. I think it.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. I think it definitely robs Lex of some of that uniqueness. But but again, going back to what I was saying, this show is not about him,
Right.
In the same way that Smallville was.
I personally, not to belabor, I just don't see the need for Lex in this show. That's the thing. I didn't think that Lex was needed in Supergirl because I think you could still do the same redeeming arc with Lena and have some things that are confusing and the is she bad, is she not, and play that game quite a bit. But now when you, like you said, you throw Lex in, now it's like, well, now there's just too many. Like now it's almost like Lena's there to be the antithesis to Lex and still offer that question. I think it's just a lot. I think that's the show to me, that they kept adding too many characters. That's what ultimately drew me away. Flash did the same kind of stuff to me too. It got too busy. I just wanted to talk about Flash.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, sad to say, I've given up on all of them, obviously, except Superman and Lois.
Correct.
But with Lena, and I don't know to what extent, if any, the comics continue to utilize Lena following that Boy of Steel arc that we read.
No.
No.
Lena was around in the late 90s
as a daughter.
As a daughter, but in the sister, that's no.
Yeah.
We've not seen her. I wouldn't mind that, actually. I think there's some. Do we?
Well, in Rebirth, she's comatose, and that's one of the motivations, or maybe even the motivation for Lex donning the suit. So, all right, I'll walk that back a little bit. So but again, it seems like the role she serves. About
that. That's slight though.
Yeah, I guess, and that's the thing. I guess the role she serves is this, sort of like incapacitated and serving as somewhat of an inspiration or motivation for Lex. But the Supergirl show and Smallville really position the character as more of an agent. Now, of course, Smallville, we don't know that she's Lena until deep into the run. She's introduced as Tess Mercer, a nod to Mercy from the animated series, and Miss Tessmacher from the movie.
Which was honestly really kind of a cool misdirect, I thought. I think it's like, wait, who is this really? And I actually didn't really see it coming when they hit it with us.
I don't think the writers saw it coming, man. I think that they invented Tess Mercer as this amalgam of Mercy and Miss Tessmacher. And then as they were in the final season, they were like, oh, okay, she could be Lena. But so you have watched Smallville, so and we talked about this, that she does have this redemption arc, and she becomes a true ally. And in the episode, it's called Abandoned from season 10, when she discovers her true...
Yes. With Granny Goodness. Yeah.
Yes. Right.
Again, like we won't talk about all that. Yeah.
I think the gist of it, and I haven't gone back to that one really specifically, but I think the gist of it was that, Lionel had an affair and fathered her and brought her to Granny Goodness's orphanage, but then reclaimed her, but her memories were erased, and then she was adopted by the Mercer family. But then Lex took her on as like a mentee, as a whole thing.
Well, and she was a Fury. Like, I can't.
Yeah. But in that episode, Clark has this whole thing. He doesn't know any of this about her, and she's just discovering it. But he has this whole thing about how Luthor blood is poison, and that really messes with her. But then they have a really lovely heart-to-heart at the end of it, where he basically offers her some some hope, and that he'll be there for her.
Yeah.
And he's able, to whatever extent being a Luthor creates this darkness in you or sets you on a path, with Tess, he's able to help, guide her towards redemption. So it's,
it's almost like he feels he couldn't redeem Lex, so he needed to do it with Tess.
The final words that Clark says to Lex on Smallville, and mind wipe aside, but the final words are, "I'm sorry I couldn't save you." It's heartbreaking. And the first time they met, it was Clark saving Lex. When they
literally
went off the bridge, right? He was able to save the body, but not the soul over the course of the series, and that will haunt him. But
I think with Lex, the ultimate, if one of the biggest moments that really kind of hurt the relationship too is when Clark sees the museum.
Yeah.
Like when Clark ultimately finds the room in the mansion that is the museum that Lex has been investigating him for all this time, I think that's also a big linchpin in that relationship, where Clark then ultimately gets scared to bring Lex in.
Yes. Yeah. At the end of season 3, when he finds that room that Lex has been keeping on him, he literally says to Lex, this friendship is over. And they're able to patch things up to an extent in season 4, but it's never quite the same. And then at the start of season 5, in the second episode, Lex sets up this test, right, where he releases inmates from meteor freaks from Belle Reve and sets them against, sends them to the Kent farm. And, Clark realizes this, and they have, it's a very heated exchange at the end, and there's fists flying, because Clark is powerless at this point. And that really was the end of them as friends.
Yeah. I mean, if the listeners haven't figured out yet that you and I are like all in on Smallville, like that really is one of say what you will, it really is one of the best shows that they ever did from a comics book standpoint.
Yes, I stand by that. And especially with respect to Lex, if nothing else, having watched a bunch of scenes and episodes back to back, it's a very strong arc. And that take on Lex, you talk about amalgams of different eras, there obviously you have the history with Clark and Lex in Smallville, very much harkening back to pre-crisis, and the fact that a father figure is playing such a prominent role. I mean, that we're really breaking new ground there. Yeah. With that. But you also have the businessman angle, and just like the post-crisis version, he deals with scientists, but he's not the one doing it himself. So, and he's never in a war suit or anything like that, but he has the kryptonite ring. Like, you really get, and I think, a nice blend of the different eras.
I really do think that the late 90s and early 2000s, as much as they always had to harken back to like having the Donnerverse as history, I think anybody doing anything now will harken back to Smallville as that same kind of history. Like, hey, let's look back to how they did it right here. That's the most recent modern telling. What can we do to either use that or come from that? I think that's how it's going to turn out.
I'm with you, man. Well, we just hit the 2-hour mark, and
yeah, baby.
We've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else about the Nemesis of the 2000s, that iteration of Luthor, that we didn't talk about that you wanted to?
No, we nailed so much. And I do think a lot of this is some of my favorite stories of Lex, I think. From Smallville through Up and Away and Birthright. That's where I go when I see Lex in my head a lot of times.
I totally agree with Smallville. And I think I maybe now, certainly more so than before, I would say the same about some of these other comic book stories that we've read. I've really come around to them in a way that I didn't think I would when I was reading them when they first came out. So,
which is the whole point of what we're doing, man. Like, it's thinking about this, and it's like, ooh, now I can kind of wrestle with this myself and argue a little bit with what I thought I knew.
It's one of the true joys of doing this podcast. And I think as a fan, it's like you can experience your fandom however you want. And some people think one thing about something and they're never going to change. And it's like, that's fine. But I don't find that as interesting. It's like, it's been such a fascinating experience to challenge a lot of these views that I had and especially to do so in this larger context, because there's so much. That's the thing. Like, there's so much when I was reading these stories the first time around that even if I knew kind of like the broad strokes of pre-crisis, like I didn't totally get everything that was happening. And now I see what's being pulled from, and it's a much richer experience for sure.
I think anything in our lives that we truly believe in and care about, it's important that we ask questions like that. I think it makes it even more special to us. And
that's why it's a fan journey. All right, my friend. Well, thank you as always for being part of this. People should check out the comic shop that you are affiliated with, Oh Yeah Comics.
Yep. Oh Yeah Comics in Skokie, Illinois. Beautiful downtown Skokie.
Excellent. Well, it's always a pleasure, Bernie. I look forward to the next time that we're able to do this. Audience, thank you for listening. Make sure you come back next week for the conclusion of the villain of the story. Returning guest Ralph Puma will be joining me, and we're going to be looking at Lex the ideologue. So we'll be looking at stories such as Brian Azzarello's Man of Steel, Grant Morrison's All-Star Superman, and Zack Snyder's Batman v Superman. So it'll be a really interesting one as we close out this event. Until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. The spin-off podcast, Digging for Justice, a DC fan journey, is available now exclusively at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato, starting at the $1 level. New episodes release monthly, and many more rewards are available too, including a robust back catalog of bonus podcasts. Thank you to all patrons for enabling me to produce this show.